take your bulletin out, on the front there's a verse down at the bottom. It's when we used to say memory verses every Sunday, this is where it would be. And so this verse, actually, we're going to make it a memory verse, because I think this verse is so crucial to the series that we're doing that I want you to have this in your brain all the time, because you're going to need it when you're experiencing brokenness in your life. So have you got it? So we're going to read it together. And if we were doing this in Awana, we'd do it every time, and then we'd mark out a word, and you'd have to do it again without the word, eventually until but we're not going to do that. Well, we might. Okay. Let's say it together. Psalm 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Do you ever feel broken in your life? Brokenness, we've defined it. We've been working on this series now for a few weeks. Brokenness is a feeling of my life isn't right. My life isn't the way that it's supposed to be. Something's wrong in my life. Sometimes I can nail it down as to what it is. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's some kind of physical ailment in my body. Sometimes it's an emotional burden that I'm bearing. Sometimes it's a struggle because of the circumstances that I'm going through in my life that may be something that I caused, or it may be something that somebody else caused. Sometimes I have something to do with it. Sometimes I have nothing to do with it. But there's a brokenness that I'm bearing in my life. Sometimes it's a lack. I need and I don't have. Sometimes it's I need to get my life right, and it's just not right. And I need help to do it because this just isn't working. We have brokenness in our lives, struggles. When we think of the word broken, break, almost overwhelmingly it's a negative. It's not something that I want to experience. It's not something that's uplifting and positive and gets me through life better. It's a down all the time, and there's a weight to it and a struggle to it, and there's a suffering to it. Brokenness. We've talked about various people in the Bible who are broken. And we've mentioned him before, but I think he's a good example of this, about this process. It's the guy Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus, the wee little man. Zacchaeus was a guy in Jesus' day who was working for the oppressors of the Jews. He was a tax collector. Tax collectors in that day were people who were hired by the Romans to collect their taxes for them. And they were given a certain quota that they had to collect. And anything above that they could get by whatever means, they could get and keep. So tax collectors became known as people who were crooked, who were oppressing their own people. But there were also people who became very wealthy because of their crookedness. But there came a point in Zacchaeus' life where he realized that he needed something else in his life. And Jesus came to him one day, and Jesus came to this town in which he was in, and Zacchaeus heard about Jesus and what he was going through and what Jesus could do. And he decided he wanted to see Jesus. And Jesus came, and Zacchaeus couldn't see him, so he climbed up a tree to see Jesus because he was so short. And when he was up there, Jesus saw him and said, Zacchaeus, come on down. I want to go to your house today. And Zacchaeus said, okay. Now, Zacchaeus was a guy who normally people wouldn't have anything to do with. But that day, something transformed in Zacchaeus' life. It changed in Zacchaeus' life. And that day, there was a brokenness. Perhaps he realized it. Perhaps he didn't realize it. But he realized at that moment there's something that he needed in his life. and he became a person who followed Jesus. And he said, I'm going to pay back everything I've taken from people. I'm going to pay it back and more. And he did, because he recognized that there was a brokenness in his life, that life wasn't working for him, and he needed something different in his life, something that he didn't have. And at that moment, his life changed. It's because he recognized his brokenness, and he changed the direction of his life. What's interesting about that story is not just that happened, but it's that Jesus welcomed him as a sinner, as a horrible, sinful person. Jesus says, I'm going to your house today. When most people would say, I don't want anything to do with you, Jesus says, not only do I recognize you and I call out your name, but I want to go to your house. You don't go to people's houses who do stuff like that. But Jesus did. Jesus recognized his brokenness. He welcomed his brokenness. And it transformed Zacchaeus' life. That's what can happen when we recognize our brokenness. We looked last week at the story of Joseph. Joseph, the guy, the Old Testament guy with the multicolored coat, Joseph guy. Joseph was the guy, if you know the story was rough. And Joseph had this coat, and he had 11 brothers and his dad, and Joseph was a guy filled with pride and telling everybody else that they should bow down to him and all that stuff. His brothers got sick of it. So they threw him into a hole to decide what to do with him. Originally wanted to kill him. But then they said, no, let's just sell him to somebody else and get some money for him. And then they'll take him away. We'll never see him again. We'll have money. Joseph's gone. We've got some money. We'll tell Dad a lie. It'll be okay. And that's what they did. So Joseph goes to Egypt as a slave. But we saw last week that rather than just being stuck in a prison as a slave, as bad as things got, because ultimately Joseph recognized his brokenness, his pride, his thinking he could do things without God in his life. He recognized how much he needed God. And God kept raising him up, even in prison. You know, you think he's in prison, how good can that be? But every time he went to prison, or wherever he was, he kept being raised up to the top. And then something bad would happen, and he'd go to another prison, and then God would raise him up to the top. And we recognize that there's a concept that in brokenness, there is blessing. In brokenness, there is blessing, that there's a connection between the two. We think brokenness is just bad. That's it. That's all it is. There's nothing good about it, period. But what we saw in Joseph's life was that there was a component, a connection to brokenness that was actually blessing. And we saw over and over again how Joseph kept getting blessed, even in the broken situation in which he found himself. Now, brokenness isn't necessarily, I get what I think I need from God to fix my brokenness. It can be. Sometimes we may get that, and we may get it right away. Sometimes we may get that blessing, but it's not for a long time. Sometimes we may go our whole life and not recognize the blessing, and it may be the people after us, it dawns on them, hey, you know, that was really a blessing in the long run for them, even if they didn't see it now. But blessing can sometimes be that I simply recognize that I have a deeper relationship with God through my brokenness than I ever would have had without it. That's the blessing that's better than any other blessing that I think I need. So brokenness can actually lead to depth in relationship with God. I can understand and see God for who He is in a way that I never would have seen Him otherwise. Have you experienced that in your life, in the struggles in your life, where you may not see it right now or at the time, but down the road, you look back and you go, that was the best thing that could ever have happened to me. It was horrible at the time. I don't ever want to go through it again. But I'm so glad it did, because I understand who God is in a way that I never would have otherwise. There's a connection between blessing and brokenness. I know that's hard to imagine when you're going through the brokenness, but it's a reality. When I speak of brokenness, what we're talking about is suffering, struggle. When people think of the existence of God, this topic often comes up. Does God really exist? And there is a question that people have when they're thinking about whether God exists or not, and it relates to the concept of suffering and brokenness. And the idea is this: when people question the existence of God, they say, well, for God to truly be God, God must be all-powerful and God must be all good. Okay? That's the premise that they have. So, if there's suffering in the world, they say there can't be God. And here's what they mean. If God is all-powerful and there is suffering, that means He would be able to get rid of it, but He doesn't want to. He is not all good. Therefore, there is no God. Or they say, if He wants to because He's good, but He's not powerful enough to get rid of it, again, by definition, He can't be God. So if He's not all good and all powerful in dealing with suffering, and there is suffering, there must be no God. Follow that? He's either all-powerful and all good, and if there's suffering, He can't be all good because He didn't get rid of suffering. He can't be all-powerful, otherwise He would get rid of suffering. But He doesn't. And so they say there is no God. That is an argument that people have written books about. It's out there. And you probably experienced that in talking to people about the existence of God. So the question is, and it relates to this concept of brokenness, the question is there a God? And I believe that there is. But secondly, how does He relate to brokenness and suffering? If He doesn't get rid of it, why doesn't He get rid of it? What does He do with it? Or does He just not care? Or He's just detached? Or it's not my problem, or you suffer, that's your problem, it's not mine. Is that how God relates to us in brokenness and suffering? I don't see that in the Bible. What I do see is this: God relates to suffering and brokenness by entering into it. God relates to suffering and brokenness by entering into it. If you look at all the religions of the world, I can't find one where God entered into the suffering of the world. But our God did. Now, how do we know that? And it relates to what we're going to be talking about here. I want you to open your Bibles to Matthew. We've been going through Matthew in our Wednesday morning men's Bible study for, about 20 years now. No, it's 15. It's not 20. We're actually almost done. Matthew chapter 26. We are in the passages now in that Bible study where we're talking about Jesus and the end of His life and the process that took place before Jesus died. Now, I want you to think of what we're about to go through here in terms of God entering into our suffering and brokenness. How did he do that? It's going to be easy once we start reading. Matthew chapter 26, verse 37. He took Peter and 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled, and then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's about to face something that God in human flesh says, "I don't want to go through it because it is so overwhelming. The thought of it almost kills me." What could God in human flesh go through that would cause him to feel like that? Let's go on. He's betrayed. He's arrested. His disciples flee. Verse 59 says, the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. False evidence against Jesus. He's going through a sentencing, and the people who are at the trial, who are administering it, are trying to come up with anything that they can find, and they don't care if it's true or not, to get rid of this guy. So they find something. He's sentenced to death. They spit on him, they hit him, they slap him, they ridicule him. He's denied 3 times by one of his closest followers. And then he's taken off to Pilate, the Roman governor. And, the Jews, they couldn't sentence Jesus to death because the Romans were in charge. So they had to get the Romans to sentence Jesus to death. But he didn't want to do it, Pilate. He wanted to release Jesus. He believed Jesus was innocent. In fact, his wife said, "He's innocent, let the guy go." But the Jews persuaded Pilate not to. And he wanted to release another guy, Barabbas, instead, and they said, "No, crucify Jesus." So he couldn't win, so here's what he did. He took water and he washed his hands. And that was the idea was, hey, it's not my problem, it's not my fault, I did what I could, I'm washing my hands of this. It's your responsibility, not mine. So he had Jesus whipped. In that day, when the Jews would whip somebody, they had a limit, 40. Romans had no limit. So they could do it as many times as they wanted to do. A little description here of the whip. The whip was made out of leather straps. Inside the leather was attached bone or bits of metal, and that was what was slapped to your back. Slapped is a nice way of putting it. In fact, people who were sentenced to be crucified but were first whipped often didn't make it through the whipping. They never even got to the crucifixion. So Jesus' body is whipped, weakened before the crucifixion. Then he does make it through that. The soldiers who were there, who were administering this torture, said, "Well, hey, I heard you're going to be a king. I heard you're a king. Let's make you up like a king." And so one of them took off his tunic, and he put it on Jesus like it was a kingly robe. And then they found these thorns nearby, and they wove them together, and they jammed them on Jesus' head. And then some guy had a staff that looked like a scepter. You know how kings hold these things, and they gave it to Jesus and said, "Hey, here you are, you're the king." Just ridicule, mock, spit on him. And then they took the staff and they whacked Jesus in the head over and over and over again. Folks, we haven't even got to the crucifixion yet, and I can't hardly stand it. So they took Jesus from that place, And they probably, we've seen different descriptions of what the cross was like, but probably it was just the crossbar that they put behind him, and he carried it like that, and he walked in the midst of a squad of 4 Roman soldiers, and they marched him out there. But you can imagine Jesus by this time even moving, let alone carrying anything. So halfway there, Jesus just collapses, and get up, and he can't get up. So they grab a guy, this guy who comes, he's on a trip here for Passover from North Africa, and they grab him and said, "You pick it up." And the guy picks it up, and he staggers, and Jesus staggers, and then they get there, and the cross. He's nailed to it. How does Jesus die from that? He doesn't die from the nailing. He dies from suffocation and heart failure. He can't get a breath. That's how Jesus dies. Jesus entering into our brokenness. But then you say, well, okay, I get that, but there's a lot of people over the years have been crucified. Why is Jesus exceptional in that regard? Because other people have been crucified. So what's different about Jesus that the crucifixion would be so horrible that in the garden he would say, "Father, I don't want to go through this." God in human flesh saying, "I don't want to go through that." What would cause him to do that? Now, when Jesus was on the cross, there was a point in which Jesus said, "Father, why have you forsaken me? Why have you forgotten me?" There's something that is so awful that is going on there, that it's a pain that Jesus is experiencing, which is infinitely beyond anything anybody on this earth has ever experienced, including people who have been crucified. What is that? What is that? There's a psalm. I want you to turn with me to Psalm 27. Psalm 27, 8 and 9. Psalm 27, this is a psalm written by David. Interesting the words that he chooses here, and think of the cross as David is writing these words. Psalm 27, verses 8 and 9. Psalm 27, 8 and 9. My heart says of you, seek his face. Your face, Lord, I will seek. Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger. You have been my helper. Do not reject me or forsake me, O God, my Savior. When you are in the depth of a relationship with someone that is the most meaningful, deep relationship you have in your life, the hardest thing that could happen to you would be for the other person to forsake you, to turn away. The pain, and you've probably experienced that in your life at some point, the pain that you had because suddenly the person doesn't want to have anything to do with you now. The pain that there is because of that. Now imagine that you have God the Father and God the Son together in relationship from eternity past, forever and ever in the past, which is the most intimate, personal relationship you can possibly imagine between God the Father and God the Son. And God the Son is on the cross, and he says, "Why have you forsaken me?" The depth of pain that is described there is beyond anything you and I have or ever will experienced. That's what Jesus was saying in the garden. I don't want to go through this. It's not the being crucified. Lots of people have been crucified. It's this. Father, don't forsake me. But it had to happen in order for the wrath of God to come on Jesus instead of us. Do you understand that? He took the forsaking for us. That's how God deals with pain and suffering and brokenness in this life. He doesn't get rid of it now. He doesn't ignore it. It's not that he doesn't care about it. He enters into it with a purpose that we might be saved. And then he will get rid of it someday. There's a passage in Revelation 21, and I read this at every funeral I've ever done and ever will do. And that day he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there'll be no more mourning or crying or pain or death. God will get rid of suffering. God will get rid of brokenness someday. But for now, he entered into it so that we could be saved. That's how God relates to brokenness, in a way that nobody else has ever done. Does God care about your brokenness? He became broken for your brokenness. He loves you. He cares about you. And someday your brokenness will be gone, and he guarantees it. But for now, he did this so that you could be saved. And that's what we celebrate today.